Time.
Right. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Insights and Innovation series for this Monday. Please apologize, I'm wearing a skivvy. I didn't think I was going to be on camera today. I was just being practical and old. It feels like that I'm your therapist. Just lie back and tell me about your childhood. But apologies about my look. I'll tell you in a second. Today we have News Corp in today, and they're going to talk about choices that the Aussies are making currently at the moment and the new economic conditions. We've got a good friend of Indy's, Michael Desiree, whose LinkedIn profile is slowly in line, and also the brains of the conversation, Lee, as well, joining us. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Desi. It's over.
Sammy, thank you so much. I do love the turtleneck. It definitely suits you, and it's a great way to kick off a Monday. And thank you so much to the IMAA family for having us for this series of webinar. Like Sammy said, I've got Lee Lavery. He'll do the majority of this talking, and he's well and truly the brains and the intelligence of this conversation. Lee is the head of News Corp Australia's Growth Intelligence Centre and is leading the team's work that is focused on helping our partners leverage our intelligence capabilities. Lee's presentation will be focused, again, like Sammy said, on choice. And as we know, the impacts to cost of living, Australians' approach to the ever-important subject in all walks of their lives. So Lee will take you through the presentation that weaves together a lot of the separate studies completed by the GIC in the last 12 months, and they are all available through the Growth Distillery. Now, if you have any information or need access to all the reports, we will send a follow-up post this, but it is the growthdistillery.com.au, or better yet, you can reach out to myself or to Nath. Nath loves a late night conversation, or obviously to your News Corp rep to leverage any of the insights or the needs for your next brief. But that's well and truly enough about me. It's over to you, Lee.
Thanks, Desi. We're just in the same room here, so bear with us while we get set up. So, can everyone hear me? Just give us a thumbs up if you've got me.
Yeah,
everyone can see me. Great. So today, as Desi touched on in the intro, on my role, I'm fortunate enough to be part of a team called the Growth Intelligence Centre within News Corp, and really our focus is ultimately we're a strategy and research centre of excellence that was stood up at first to help guide News Corp in what consumers are thinking and doing and what they're likely to do next. But what we've found over the last year, to 18 months, is that a lot of the things that we're learning is really applicable to our partners' worlds also. And so now what we're doing is we're becoming much more market facing, and hence the brand, the Growth Distillery. And so we, as part of our work, a lot of the studies that we're completing will now begin to be housed on that microsite. So today's presentation, I'm going to take you through a whistle-stop tour of a lot of work that we've done in the last 12 to 18 months. It really centers around choice. And when I say choice, ultimately, given the current climate, this is masquerading as trade-offs. Now, all of us are feeling the pinch to some degree, with our cost of living. And what we're seeing is that Australians are being forced to make choices around, the everyday, but also through to the bigger type decisions in our lives also. And without going into too much detail around specific categories, what we've tried to understand in the last 12 months is what are the key elements that are influencing those choices. And so today I'm going to take you through a high-level summary of what we've learned. And right now, I'm not sure if there's any Talking Heads fans on the call, but I'm certainly in that cohort. And I don't know about you. I've just turned 40. I've got a mortgage. I've got 2 kids, and occasionally this song comes on my Apple Music playlist, and I hear this line, well, how did I get here? And then I stop and I reflect, and I think, what the hell has happened, not only in the last probably 10 years, but particularly in the last 10 months. And I know, and like I touched on from our research, we can see that a lot of Australians are feeling this way. So today we're going to try and explain, how did we all get here in 2023? Firstly, this slide here, we talk about the moment of reckoning is here. When we first started looking at this this subject, it was probably late last year. And when we first wrote a version of this slide, we wrote that the moment of reckoning is coming. At that stage, this idea of the mortgage cliff was still on the horizon. The idea of interest rates potentially rising further was being talked about, but hadn't yet happened. But the reality is it's now, it's the waves hit. And there's nothing more, I think, emphasises this point than the RBA in April 2023, so 3 months ago, came out and gave the prediction that if interest rates got to 3.75, if the cash rate got to 3.75, there'd be 300,000 Australian households, or the equivalent of 15%, would be going backwards by the end of this year. As it stands today, don't need to be an economist, but you'd be aware that the cash rate sits at 4.1%. So that moment of reckoning is absolutely here right now. We're on the precipice of having to all make trade-offs in our lives. These are now mandatory; they're no longer discretionary. And as a result, the hearts are racing. What we can see is 9 in 10 Australians are reporting that their day-to-day costs have risen in the last 12 months, and 8 out of 10 of us expect that our spending habits are going to have to change in the next 12 months. 2/3 feel that we're in a worse financial position. Almost 2/3 are concerned about our financial future. And this is one of the sadder points, is 42% of us feel hopeless. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. I'm not going to sit here and try and paint a bleak picture today. We think there's plenty of opportunity, not only for our business, but also for our partners. And we see that this time that we're sitting within, a lot of hearts are up for grabs. We know from research that 2/3 of Australians, but also I think this is a global stat, have changed their spending in the past 6 months. And again, that 8 in 10 I mentioned before that are changing their spend, that's actually, they're up for grabs. So 8 in 10 anticipate they will change their spending in the next 12 months. That creates opportunities for brands to create new relationships. So we think that this actually is a great time for businesses such as our clients and partners, and also for ours, is to build those new relationships. But the key for today is understanding, how do we actually influence that choice? And then, you don't have to, again, be a Talking Heads fan to, again, appreciate this line, how do I work this? And that's what we're going to take you through. Now, today, we want to talk about this. There's really, in our eyes, there's 2 big buckets, or how we've approached it. Firstly, there's a bucket that looks at the motivational drivers that are influencing consumers' choice. Within this bucket, we see 3 really important elements. Firstly, the emotional drivers. Secondly, the existential drivers. So this idea of realizing that time is ticking for all of us in our respective lives. And then the third point is the environmental motivators, or treat that as for the greater good, not just about the environment, but also the broader set of various topics that are top of mind for all of us in trying to make a better world. Then the second bucket is more looking at the navigational principles that we're using with our choices. Firstly, what do we deem essential? What can't we live without? Then secondly, we're looking at money and how we're managing it, and thinking about our own navigational principles for what we decide we can afford, and what we're doing from a wealth management perspective. And then lastly, it's also looking at how we decide what's premium and how we're protecting those premiums, which we think has a lot of great takeaways for a variety of categories, which we want to take you through. So that's ultimately going to be today's agenda. And like I said at the start, this is actually building on a lot of work that our team has done, and you'll see a lot of this work on the Growth Distillery, thegrowthdistillery.com.au. And also, as we go through the report, I'll have slides like this where I'll talk to specifically what reports that we're referencing. So the first part of today is we're going to talk quickly about the emotional drivers that we see influencing choice. Now, this is a subject that our team has done quite a bit on, and it's something that we would love the opportunity to take you through. But it's ultimately, we've looked at so far travel, food, health, and we have property coming out shortly. But when we talk about the emotional drivers, we refer to it using what we call the Kester-Limner wheel, which is this beautiful color wheel on the right. It's not as sophisticated as it may seem. It's actually a wheel that's got 4 quadrants. The top of the page is a more active, actively engaged emotions. The bottom of the page is a more receptive or more passive emotions. To the left, you can see the negative emotions, and to the right, you can see the positive emotions. And you can think about this using this Kestel-Limner wheel. It's a way that we are able to articulate and map how consumers are feeling about the various categories of products and services that are available. It's also a way for us to map how different pieces of content and topics make our audiences feel. So this is a really handy wheel, and it's something that we use, as I said, we've used in a number of our studies that are available on the Growth Distillery. But for the point of this discussion today, what we wanted to really highlight is that we know that emotions play a bigger role than many Australians like to believe. From our research partners, the lab, we've got data to suggest that there's a 23% lift in sales volume when emotional connections are used in messaging compared to rational communications. Now, what this really stresses to us is, both for our brands, but also for the brands that we work with, is just how important it is to understand the emotional footprint of consumers as they think about your proposition or service, particularly when they're making these choices that we're talking about. To give you some examples to bring it to life a little bit. So we did a piece on travel. Now, you don't have to have a PhD in behavioral economics to think that travel will be driving positive emotions. What was interesting was when we looked at the subset of travel and how there's differing emotions, probably in the positive sphere, but between the passive and the active, but also the different types of services that elicited more extreme positive feelings compared to, say, the more moderated versions. Similarly, with food, we saw again when you talk to those occasions within food that is about bringing friends and family together. Again, that really lent into the high positive emotions. And so, for instance, thinking of some of the products within the food category that can orient themselves towards those occasions where you're bringing families together. Christmas lunch, for example, we know that really resonates and that brings together. That elicits a much stronger connection from audiences, say, to the more transactional style food propositions that may be out there around lunchbox fillers, etc. So again, just an example. We're looking at property as we speak, and that's something that'll come out in the not too distant future. Now, property is a bit of a scary one. Again, it's a really, really intense set of emotions, but it wasn't anywhere near as strongly skewed towards the positive. There's a lot of negative emotion, probably a lot of fear with property, both from the rental and also the owner's perspective. But we could see it was really spread. Now, as we're getting further into property, we're going to look at which elements of which resonate to which parts of the property conversation. Again, with the aim of being able to influence our audience emotionally to think about their choices in a way that they can get the best outcome, but also we can help steer them towards the best outcome for our partners. Now, the second big element from the motivational lens is looking at this idea of youthfulness is what we're referring to. And now this is a study that we partnered with Ogilvy recently on, and our cans and cans, or however you say it, I always get confused which parts are cans and can, but anyway, the guys who went to far north Queensland, they talked about this here, and there was quite a lot discussed around it, but we had some really amazing takeaways around youthfulness isn't just for youth is ultimately the key takeaway. A lot of people think that Gen Z have the monopoly on youthfulness. What we've learned is it's not actually the case. Now, when we talk about youthfulness, what we're talking about is the search, and it's our research reveals that it's as omnipresent as ever. More of us are aware of the ticking clock, in our lives than ever before, and as a result, that's actually influencing a lot of things we do, and how we make our choices and how we think about how we want to live. And we know that's a real big motivator for a lot of us in terms of whether it be that health kick, whether it be that holiday, or whether it be that new car. We know it does make a difference. Now, I touched on this already, but youth and youthfulness are not the same thing. Youthfulness isn't bound to any age group. It's actually, it's better defined as a mindset. And the mindset and the behaviors that particularly drives that perspective. Now, what we can see is there's less than 40% of Australians actually feel youthful, and less than 1 in 3 millennials don't feel youthful, and less than 1 in 4 Gen Z don't feel youthful. So you kind of assume that youthfulness would just sit beautifully within the millennials and the Gen Z. It's not actually the case. Now, going a little bit more into the definition. So what we define youthfulness as is ultimately the capacity for someone to be on the search for those moments of youthfulness. And what we mean by that is having the possibility and the capability to pursue those things in your life that, help you realize your identity, or help you achieve what you define as success, or help you really capture those moments of enjoyment, that moments of enjoyment and with connection, so with those people that you love. If you think about having that time and space, and even financial means to be able to tick off all four of those pillars of youthfulness. And so if you think of youthfulness, one thing that we ask people to do when we're talking about this is to imagine someone that oozes youthfulness. And when we did this exercise with the 2,000 Australians that were part of this study, we came back, and a lot of their feedback on what youthfulness was could be bucketed into these four components. Now, the other thing too is often you see a lot of overlap. People that exhibit youthfulness actually have very clear a number of factors in their life that tick these four boxes. And what was interesting when we looked at people that defined youthfulness and lived this idea of the search in their everyday, that 48% of boomers have more time dedicated to youthful activities because they've got that time, that space, and the means to do so. And boomers have more than millennials, and they had 30% of boomers had more time than Gen Z, which, if you start to picture that in your mind, how that works, it paints a picture which we drew up quite early in the piece, which was this idea of, we call it the shit gets real curve. Now, this chart, you can see you've got the capacity element, so how much capacity, and then the bottom axis is age or life stage. So our hypothesis going into this study was that people younger have more capacity for youthfulness. As you hit midlife, around that 40 mark, which I'd certainly be at the bottom of this curve right now, shit gets real. You don't have as much time, space, or capacity to pursue, those four elements that we talked about. But then as you get older and the pressure starts to relieve itself, what we expected was that's when, your boomers and your Gen Xers, they start to be able to have that time to start to pursue those things that, make them ultimately happy. Now, from a brand perspective, we felt this is really powerful, right? Because often when we think of, we all want to achieve growth for the brands that we work with and being able to sell more of whatever products or services we're talking about. Ultimately, when we talk youth, we always just simply go to one side of the curve, right? But what we haven't really factored in is that actually there's almost equal opportunity at both sides of the curve if we can think about and use our imaginations of how can we tap onto that youthfulness with these older cohorts. Now, this was our working hypothesis, but what we actually discovered shocked us. When we went through and spoke to the 2,000, and we went through and conducted I think it was a 14-week analysis of a number of interviews and various forms, what we revealed was it was actually quite confronting. The reality was different. We found that from a capacity perspective, and that means, again, having the cash, having the time, and having the space to pursue it, Gen Z were really drowning in the pressures of life to get ahead, to get started, to get, to even get settled in, things such as their career or property, or for whatever ways that they were really stretched. And what we actually found, and conversely, was Gen X and your boomers, they were the lucky ones in terms of the age groups that had the capacity to pursue these youthfulness style pursuits. And ultimately, the shit gets real. The millennials, we're right in the middle of it. We still feel the pinch. So that was true in the hypothesis, but also in the results. Now, what we think this means, and again, I've touched on it already, is often when we think about growth, we think about youth. Now, what we're suggesting from this research is it's not as clear cut as that. Brands that can see an opportunity with tapping into the pursuit of youthfulness amongst older cohorts actually open themselves up to a somewhat discounted or forgotten about audience. And we see that's where the true disposable income, more time, and still have that fire alive to pursue, new products and services and new ambitions in those later years. Right, now moving on to the third big piece of the motivational layer, we can see for the greater good. And again, this is one that gets a lot of coverage, and ultimately you can think of this as ESG. We have a piece called Forces of Good, which will be coming out to market shortly. It's one that we've got penciled in to be in market with in Q1 FY24. So please keep an eye out for it, or get in touch with Desi and the team if you're interested in finding out more. But ultimately, in a very quick nutshell, what we found from the study is that Australians expect companies now and businesses, to take responsibility on issues of goodness. It's no longer a case of optional or discretionary. It's actually a hygiene thing. We expect our businesses that we work with and that we consume to take the moral higher ground on issues that are relevant for their category. Now, I say that deliberately because what we found is goodness is not just one thing. It's not just sustainability. When we ask people to prioritize and to allocate how they see and define goodness, what we found is it's actually a real spread. And for the sake of the research that we've conducted, we identified 7 common areas where goodness can be seen. Now, firstly, there's things such as sustainability. That's quite an obvious one. But there's also things around ethical supply chains, which, again, none of these I think will surprise anyone on the call. More a case of the fact that I want to articulate just the diversity or how spread these topics actually are. Then, touching on diversity, obviously you talk about people and culture. Then you can talk about community and making sure that we're giving, various communities within our country, but also globally, the support and the platforms that they deserve. Data, tech, and privacy is a huge one that we're all experiencing in 2023, both in the businesses that we work with, our own consuming behaviour, and also the businesses that we decide to partner with as consumers. The products and their development and how they're produced. I think there's plenty to unpack in that space. And then from an ethics perspective around what's fair, what's reasonable, and what do we expect as a society is in the best interest of the greater good. So I wanted just to highlight this because sometimes when we talk about goodness, we all naturally have a bias to which of these 7 are most relevant to us. But we want to really stress that it is a real balanced outlook that depending on the category that you're sitting within, you'll have a potential variety of these 7 forces. Now, the punchline is in the context of this inflationary environment that we are living through, that price is the number one barrier holding people back from making more good choices. What we found was that less than half of consumers, almost half, 47%, are not willing to pay a premium for good. 72% of consumers already say that cost of living is impacting their ability to make good choices. So we can see that while 87% of Australians value it, and it's almost now just assumed, people still are reluctant to pay for it. And what we found also, and this is with our partners Kanto, is businesses that can demonstrate perceived goodness without charging a premium will cut through and reap the rewards. We can see that businesses with a higher ESG score have a 1.2 multiple higher market value than those that don't. And we can see that the top-rated brands on the Kantar Sustainability Index grew their brand value 25% year on year. Now, that's compared to the market, which was 15%. So, again, you can see that 10% uplift. So the results are in. This actually does work. It's just that do not expect consumers to pay for your good. They expect it of you, but they're not willing to pay in this current environment. Now, that's the motivational factors covered. And you're probably going, well, that's wonderful. And probably, hopefully, you're excited by some of the takeaways, and you can already start to shape how you might do things differently with your partners and brands. But we now want to go into a bit more talking heads. And and again, if everyone's familiar with the song, you'd probably know these lines as well. And these lines start to make you think, well, how do I actually navigate this? And what are the principles that we can apply? And where does that highway actually go to? And so the next part we'll be talking about these navigating themes that we've identified that are influencing choice. So the first branch of this part of the presentation, we're going to talk about 4 key themes we've identified, which Australians really resonate towards as being essential in the current climate. And I'll talk to that in a little bit more detail in a moment. The second part of this navigational element is looking at how people are managing their money. And what we're saying is really there's 2 cohorts, those that are leaning in to managing their money and those that are leaning out and putting their head in the sand. And the last piece of this navigational chapter, we'll be looking at a really fascinating case study we've seen in food, but we think it has applications for other categories, and that's how people are protecting their premium. And so I'll dive into it now. So firstly, from an essentials perspective, we And you can check out, again, the growthdistillery.com.au. We're actually doing a series called the Distilled Series this year, and we've tackled 3 of 6 chapters so far. But one of the chapters we did right at the very start was on essentials. Now, at the crux of this piece of work was we analysed 64 different categories. And what we wanted to do is understand, and one of the specific examples is we wanted to understand in a scenario in the not too distant future, with inflation hitting 10%, which was always done as an extreme scenario, and hopefully we don't get there. But we wanted to understand from a choice modelling perspective, what would Australians continue to do so, and what would they choose not to do so? And we did I think there was 64, and we matched them against each other. It was almost a bit of a knockout competition, and we got a long list of from the stuff that was the most resilient through to the categories that they would switch off tomorrow if they had to. And without presenting a list of winners and losers, because we realized that's probably not helpful for anyone, what we wanted to do instead was analyze what do we think are the themes that were emergent amongst those categories that were more resilient. And we spent a lot of time with our research partners, Verve, and also we worked with Fonto, who provide transactional data on consumers, anonymised, of course. And what we were able to do is work out the categories that were the most resilient, what were the themes that we could identify. And these are the 4 on the screen that stood out. Now, there's some icons on screens which give you clues to some of the obvious categories. But the key thing for this, and if I can leave you with one key takeaway on this slide, is while these 4 themes may have obvious categories, we believe these themes can be applied to almost any product or service. And so what we want to really stress is the opportunity is there for brands to think about how you can leverage some of these themes with your own marketing communications to position your brand as leveraging these opportunities in how you speak to consumers and influence their choice. And so first one being escapism, for example. Now, what we see with escapism, that is this idea of we want to get off the grid. All of us as consumers feeling the pressure, feeling, what seems to be a pretty tough time. We love and we're prioritizing those opportunities to switch off. Now, we see this through our subscriptions to STV. We see this through our subscriptions to, other entertainment and media. We see it through also short-term travel. Similarly, when we look at shared experience, that was the second theme. The idea of shared experience. During COVID, all of us, were forced to push this one away and not have those shared experiences, right? So we're seeing a bit of a lag or a bit of a rebound, with now we crave that above all else. And so we're prioritizing, those, again, short-term trips away or those mid-term trips away, but those things we do with our family and our loved ones and our friends. Also, could be just a cheap and cheerful dinner out with friends at the, at a midpoint restaurant. But we're seeing shared experience is the second theme. The third one we've called micro moments. Now, this is very similar to, I think it's pretty commonly referred to as the lipstick effect. And this is the idea of at a smaller price point, consumers still prioritize and want to protect those small indulgences in their lives. That can be the morning coffee. For some, it could be the trip to the bakery that I know Desi loves doing on a Saturday morning. But it's ultimately finding those small indulgences that you're willing to, it could be the 6-pack on the Friday night in front of the TV watching the footy. But whatever those small indulgences might be for you, we can see that consumers are protecting them. Now, the last one, but definitely not the least, is actually the most prominent, was this idea of being well. Now, you might be going, being well, don't you mean health and wellness? Well, it is part of that, but it's actually, we think it's slightly broader, and we can stretch it to this idea of being well can actually be applicable to things that might not be necessarily in your best interest for your health at times, but more about feeling good. And we think there's an opportunity for brands to talk to consumers about things that make them feel good. And so we see that Australians are prioritizing how they feel. We know that mental health is a real priority for a lot of Australians. So thinking about how brands can help consumers feel good about themselves and being well will be really, really important. And again, that's the fourth of these principles. Now, as I touched on, we think the opportunities for brands is to think about whether you're an automotive brand and you're selling utes. You could pretty much, again, talk to the feel-good factor of driving a ute, or ultimately maybe the shared experience of working with someone that you love on a particular job. We like to think that all of these themes are applicable to almost all categories. Sorry, just moving on. Now, the other thing that we think was really interesting, and we've done a piece on personal finance as part of the Distilled series, so if you're interested, check it out there. But the other thing we thought was really fascinating was how people are managing their money on a day-to-day, but also longer term, how their goals and dreams may have evolved. And what we found ultimately was there's two very clear mindsets with how people are approaching money in this current climate. There's those that are really leaning in, and there's those that are really leaning out. The clear divide was financial IQ. So how not so much savvy, but how confident were people in understanding their own situation, but also understanding what their options are. Now, for those people leaning in, what we could see was some really distinct behaviours. They had their eyes wide open. They were really, again, looking at trying to understand more about what options they had to alleviate some of the pressure and the stress that they're facing in this current scenario. But they told us they're more confident in their ability, and long term, we actually saw greater outcomes for this group. Those with a higher financial IQ ultimately had higher hope for what their outlook looked like. Secondly, we noticed that they were much more likely to be spending time and money and effort in building up their safety nets. They're twice as likely to have enough insurance to cover their, all the various possible scenarios that could, play out. But they really did have a focus on making sure that they had both a strong attacking game, but also a defensive game. And the third key characteristic of those leaning in was that they were also looking at ways to create passive wealth and maximizing their money. They're looking at investing in shares, creating other complementary income streams, and also making additional contributions to superannuation. So while it's a high stakes game for both sides of the coin, what we could see was those leaning in were certainly much more proactive in playing the game. And we think this is important for brands to understand. You don't need to be in the personal finance category as a brand, but ultimately it's important to understand how people are going to pay for your service or product. And if you can tap into where consumers might sit, whether they're on the lean in or lean out side of the spectrum, can actually help you with your own messaging and what levers you might want to pull with how you can make your product attractive in this climate. Now, the other side of the coin, again, was this leaning out cohort. And ultimately, it's easiest to describe these guys as having their head in the sand and, not wanting to appreciate the situation that they're in. They almost half feel a sense of hopelessness and they feel exposed. And the managing day to day, they're really just hanging on week to week. They're really struggling. Their primary focus is about increasing their income. They need to pay off their debt to try and relieve some pressure. And then, as a sort of secondary thought, they're thinking about what can I do to create complementary income. And so if you can think of these two sides of the coin and think about where your audience or your customer base lean towards, it can really hopefully help you influence their choice with how they think about your products and services. Right, now the last piece of the puzzle in the navigational bucket is looking at how people are protecting their premiums. And food was where this really shone through. We know that the cost of living is stretching household budgets and forcing Aussies to make trade-offs, and we can see this in food particularly. Now, what we learned from food really was that the pandemic ignited a hunger for premium food experiences, whether it be, the fancy sourdough that you're making yourself, or whether it be the sort of the chin chin's home delivery that some of us might have got, through to, having a slightly, more upweight, more expensive wine instead of going out to the local wine bar. All of us we know household savings went through the roof, and you don't need me to tell you that we all had more time than we'd ever wished for. And so those two things came together and meant that we were, taking on the finer things in life in abundance. Now, obviously, the cost of living curve dealt a blow to that luxurious lifestyle, and it meant that those things that we'd fallen in love with, that became part of our lives, we had to then really think about, well, how much could we actually afford to maintain? And so we needed to make some trade-offs with what we were doing with our food. But I think, again, you can apply this to a number of categories beyond just food. So then we had to think about, okay, well, let's take food as an example. What Australians really, we could see their behaviour, they really did protect their premium. There were premiums in food that they weren't willing to give up. They built up this appreciation for these finer things, and what we saw was trade-offs where they would stop and cease on other elements that previously had been a staple. And then the most important thing from this element was we saw that the results were really spread. There wasn't a clear everyone loves sourdough, or everyone's eating fresh fruit and veg, or everyone is valuing Uber delivered to their door with the $35 ice cream. So what we saw is that actually what we value in our premium is all very, very different. And so when we realized that, we actually found that there's 5 pillars of premium for food. Now, these 5 are specifically for food, but I think it's a good thing for brands in other categories is to think about, well, what are the elements of premium for our categories? And to think about, well, how does my audience, or how does my consumers orient to premium in my category? And what are they willing to not live without? And what are they willing to concede? And so what we saw from food was the 5 that stands out. And this was these are fairly common in the food category, but health, convenience, taste, exploration, and socialization. And ultimately, all Australians, we have any number of these 5 that we deem important, but we'll trade off elsewhere to protect that premium is the key story. And ultimately, what we want to really stress is that for brands out there right now that are wanting to build these new relationships in this reset environment, we think that by doubling down on what you do exceptionally well and what your brand delivers as a premium will actually put you in the best possible shape to continue to have those meaningful relationships, not only with your existing customers, but also future customers. We think that, understanding that premium and that premium footprint will give you the best chance to avoid having to take on, price pressure type negotiations or discussions to try to appeal to a broader base. Instead, you double down on what's important to your customers now. And that's it in terms of the 6. I just wanted to leave you with the 6 key takeaways or questions to chew on. Maybe that was a pun off the back of food, but ultimately, starting at the top, when we think about what are the motivational drivers, we want you to really think about how do you influence choice, and understanding what is your brand's emotional footprint is a great place to start. Secondly, thinking about how can your brand or products or services leverage youthfulness to appeal not just to the youth. Thirdly, for everybody out there, but particularly for businesses, do good, be proud, but don't pass on the cost. Was a key takeaway from the Forces of Good work. From an essentials perspective, think about what are the essential themes that you can borrow from or leverage with how you communicate to your customers that can make them really resilient and they can't live without your service. Also from a money perspective, think about how they are living in this space and how they are managing their own money circumstance. That might give you clues for how you can influence choice. And then lastly, and I think this is marketing 101, but it's certainly paramount in this current day and age, is to know what your premium is to your customers and make sure that you double down on that and avoid the price wars. So that's it in terms of the research. Again, it was a whistle-stop tour. If you want to know more, head to thegrowthdistillery.com.au. That's where all of our work is there, including the distilled series, which is underway. In terms of the distilled series, here's just a quick snapshot of what we are tackling. You can see I mentioned with the essentials work is there, so you can jump in there and see a lot more on those 4 themes. Personal finance, there's a 40 or 50 slide pack there that covers off all of the subcategories within personal finance, but also some really powerful cohorts. And then food distilled, that actually dropped today. So today is day 1 for food distilled. So everything I've just given you, you guys are the first to see on food. In the not too distant future, over the back end of the next 6 months of this year, we'll be covering travel, then health, and then home and lifestyle. And that's it. As always, if you want to find out more, please speak to Desi and the team and reach out to get a session in the diary. We'd love to take you through it in further detail.
Thank you, guys. Desi, do you want to say a few words?
Oh, there we go. Sammy, sorry. Lee, thanks again, mate. That's there's a lot of information that you just taken us through, which is obviously fascinating and interesting. Maybe just a couple of things, if you can answer this for me. There's probably some agencies here that maybe don't have strategists that might want to be able to do something a little bit more bespoke, maybe for their category or interests. if say for example, any of our sales teams right across the country want to do something a little bit more bespoke for an agency within travel, as an example, what's the process? Can we organize something directly through you, take you out and do something a little bit more bespoke and work through maybe some of the challenges that the agencies may have?
Yeah, Desi. So firstly, all of this research that we've showcased today, we have the data files for, and we can mash that up and combine it and look at more bespoke cuts of it. So that's the first thing. But in terms of your question, the way we operate, we'll obviously be guided by Michael and his team, and also Nath. So we'll trust their judgment on the best use of our time. So yeah, again, we'll be good. So best is to steer any inquiries into Desi, and then we'll work with Desi to help the best we can.
And sometimes we might get a question on, is there a membership fee, that agencies need to pay for, to get access to any of this particular data or content? Do they have to pay for anything essentially for this? Is there a cost associated?
No, that's another really good question. And look, as we stand today, the growthdistillery.com.au is our front of house, and that if you jump on there, you'll see that there's a fair bit there already, but that's something that we're going to continue to build out and populate. And so that's going to be, again, something that's a resource that's there for the market, and we really encourage you to use as much as possible. So no, there's no subscription fees or anything like that, and I don't think there's any intention for that to be the case. But I'd say head to the growthdistillery.com. That's your best first step. Now, if you want to know more about any of these topics, again, second step would be to work in with Desi and the AMP team. I think Nathan's on the call, and they'll help steer us in answering the questions in the most valuable way.
Thanks again, Lee. And probably this is for all of the members and Sammy and the IMAA team. At the latest board member meeting that I was part of with Sam, one of the key things that the board essentially asked of news was having better access to news, better access in terms of research, better access in terms of data. I urge the IMAA and all of the members and everybody on this call, please reach out to us. This well and truly doesn't cost anything. It is funded by News Corp. There's a considerable amount of time and investment that we put into this that really helps not only in our responses back to you guys, but also for you as agencies to think about, how can you win more businesses? How do you keep the current clients that you have that are trying to look for answers? And I think that's one of the beautiful parts of being a member of the IMAA. You all have access to this. You have access to us. There's a lot more information that we can help, and hopefully we can be considered upfront when you're thinking about your brief responses and how we can build some of that strategy work. So on behalf of News Corp, Lee, and all of the News Corp teams that are on here today, we thank you again for your ongoing support. And please reach out any particular time. There might be something in here that we can unpack and work through together, or even maybe something that we've missed that could be on your roadmap that we